Cop insults black woman at airport, shocked when she calls her husband. The airline owner, Monica Johnson, stood in the quiet sanctuary of her suburban home, the soft autumn sunlight streaming through the tall windows and casting a warm glow over the meticulously packed medical supplies laid out before her. At 32, she carried herself with an unshakable grace and confidence forged by years of hard work and unwavering determination, a Harvard-educated attorney turned humanitarian, whose life's mission was to bring hope and healing to some of the world's most vulnerable communities. Today was no ordinary day. It marked the beginning of yet another journey. A critical mission to a remote refugee camp in Sudan where basic medical necessities were scarce and lives hung in the balance. Her carefully prepared carry-on was filled with life-saving antibiotics, vaccines, and specialized medical equipment, each item painstakingly gathered and vetted to ensure it would make the difference between life and death for children whose faces she had only ever seen in photos. As she folded the last piece of documentation into her bag, her phone buzzed with a familiar ringtone, a private melody reserved for her husband, David Johnson. The screen lit up with a photograph of them together in Rwanda just a year before. Their smiles radiant against the backdrop of a land they both loved and served. David, a man who had climbed from humble beginnings as a nighttime baggage handler at O'Hare Airport to become the visionary CEO of Skyline Airlines, was not just her partner in marriage but a steadfast ally in her humanitarian endeavors. Their shared history was one of grit and perseverance, a testament to what could be achieved with relentless passion and unyielding support for one another. Though David's voice carried the exhaustion of early morning meetings, it was filled with genuine regret as he told Monica how he wished he could accompany her on this trip. But the pressing demands of finalizing a new Paris route expansion anchored him firmly behind his desk. Monica smiled softly, her eyes reflecting a deep understanding and shared purpose. This mission was hers to lead. And she was ready. Outside, a modest sedan awaited, a humble contrast to the magnitude of their ambitions, but precisely the kind of grounded, practical approach they had always embraced. With passport and vaccination records in hand, Monica took a final breath, centering herself for the journey ahead, unaware that the greatest challenges she would face that day would not be the deserts of Sudan, but the unforgiving corridors of an American airport terminal, where prejudice and power threatened to overshadow her mission of mercy before it had even truly begun. As Monica Johnson approached the sleek check-in counters of Skyline Airlines at the bustling international terminal, a subtle shift rippled through the air, barely perceptible to most but sharp and unmistakable to her seasoned intuition. The polished agent behind the counter glanced at Monica's passport, then flicked her eyes to the computer screen displaying her first-class reservation to Paris. A key step on her humanitarian mission. A faint crease appeared on his brow, a flicker of doubt crossing his features as he questioned her booking aloud. His voice tinged with disbelief. "First class to Paris? Are you sure about that?" The words hung in the air like a challenge, implying that a woman like Monica, well-dressed, composed, and undeniably poised, couldn't possibly belong in such a privileged seat. Monica met his gaze steadily, unwavering and calm, sliding her confirmation across the counter with quiet authority. "Yes, I'm certain." Yet the skepticism lingered, woven through the agent's hesitant taps on the keyboard, his tone softening into a patronizing query about payment for any extra baggage or in-flight purchases. Monica replied confidently that everything was within the allowance, her first-class ticket covering all she carried. Nearby, a white businessman in a rumpled suit approached the adjacent counter and was greeted with effortless warmth and efficiency, no questions, no insinuations, just a smooth check-in process that spoke volumes about the invisible barriers Monica faced. With boarding pass in hand, Monica made her way toward security, the hum of travelers and the clang of rolling suitcases forming a backdrop to the mounting tension. There, Officer Mark Stevens stood like a sentinel at the entrance to the priority lanes, directing passengers with practiced ease. White families with children were ushered swiftly through the express lanes. Business travelers in crisp suits were waved forward with a nod. Even a Hispanic man in a tailored ensemble was eventually granted passage after a brief scrutiny. But when Monica, ticket and priority access clearly displayed, stepped forward, Stevens' demeanor hardened. Without a glance at her boarding pass, He brusquely redirected her to the long, slow-moving regular line, dismissing her polite assertion of her priority status. His refusal was firm, his tone unyielding. "We need to verify that. Step aside." Monica's heart sank slightly, but her voice remained steady as she challenged the blatant inconsistency in treatment, pointing out how every other passenger with similar documentation had passed without delay. The crowd around them began to notice, some pulling out their phones, others exchanging uneasy glances. Just then, Karen Mitchell, the terminal operations supervisor, appeared, her eyes darting between Monica and Stevens. Monica seized the moment to report the discriminatory treatment, only to be met with dismissive reassurances that security protocols were being followed, that selections were random and based on algorithms she could not know. Monica, sharp and observant, knew better. The pattern was painfully clear, a covert, systemic prejudice cloaked in the language of security. The tension thickened as Stevens insisted Monica follow him for additional screening. His steps deliberate, his attitude laced with an unmistakable edge of condescension. Monica complied, surrounded by curious onlookers whose reactions ranged from sympathetic nods to silent discomfort. Each witness to a quiet injustice unfolding under the bright, indifferent lights of the international terminal, led away from the bustling stream of travelers into a stark, glass-walled room set apart from the main security lanes. Monica Johnson felt the weight of every gaze, some filled with quiet sympathy. Others turned away in discomfort or indifference, as Officer Mark Stevens methodically began his invasive inspection. His latex-gloved hands moved with calculated slowness, deliberately prolonging the process as he pulled each item from her meticulously packed carry-on, scrutinizing everything with exaggerated suspicion. When he reached the carefully labeled boxes of antibiotics and vaccines destined for the refugee camp in Sudan, his eyebrows shot up in feigned surprise, his voice dripping with condescension as he muttered, "That's quite a lot of medication. What's all this for?" Monica met his gaze steadily and explained, her voice unwavering despite the growing frustration simmering beneath. "These are donations for a medical camp in Sudan. I have all the proper documentation and import permissions right here." She extended a clear folder toward him, but Stevens barely spared it a glance, dismissing the papers as trivial. "Sounds like a lot of trouble to go through. Most people just take a vacation without lugging around all this baggage." His words were meant to sting, to diminish not only her presence in first class but the very purpose of her journey. "This isn't a vacation," Monica replied firmly. "It's humanitarian work." Undeterred, Stevens continued to unload her belongings with theatrical suspicion, his hands rifling through designer luggage as though the mere presence of luxury justified his distrust. He held up her boarding pass, turning it over slowly, his tone mocking. "First class. Humanitarian work. Interesting combination. How do you afford this?" The unspoken accusation hung thick in the air. A black woman with a first-class ticket was an anomaly, a challenge to the unspoken order Stevens sought to enforce. Nearby passengers shifted uncomfortably, some reaching for their phones. Sensing the escalating tension, Monica, refusing to be cowed, spoke his name aloud. "Officer Stevens, I understand you have a job to do, but your comments about my appearance, my ticket, and my profession are irrelevant and inappropriate." A flush of anger crossed Stevens' face as his facade cracked. "I decide what's relevant here," he snapped, "and your attitude is becoming a concern." The interaction had crossed from professional procedure into personal vendetta, Stevens' demeanor darkening as he stepped closer, invading Monica's space with deliberate intimidation. "You know what I've noticed in my 15 years on the job? First class is for people who can afford it, not people like you." The words struck like a blow, raw with naked prejudice. Monica's breath caught for a moment, her composure wavering only to steel itself anew. "I'd like to speak to your supervisor immediately." "My supervisor's busy," Stevens retorted, dismissive and smug. Undeterred, Monica persisted. "Then I'd like to speak to their supervisor." Your comment was discriminatory. The room's atmosphere thickened with unease as Stevens' patience snapped. "You're being disruptive," he hissed, voice low but sharp, "interfering with security procedures. That's a federal offense." Monica met the accusation with calm resolve. "I understand my rights. Your personal comments have no place in this procedure." Stevens, now openly hostile, leaned in, his voice a venomous whisper. You people always think you know your rights. Always playing the victim. Monica's refusal to retreat, her quiet strength in the face of baseless accusations, transformed the sterile security room into a battleground of power, prejudice, and resilience, witnessed silently by the travelers around her, some willing to watch, others unsure if they dared intervene. Officer Mark Stevens's scrutiny of Monica Johnson's belongings dragged on with deliberate cruelty. Each movement calculated to inflict discomfort without leaving visible marks. His fingers toyed with the neatly arranged medical supplies, boxes of antibiotics, vials of vaccines, meticulously labeled and destined for children in a Sudanese refugee camp, handling them carelessly as if they were mere props in a game of power rather than lifelines for vulnerable lives. "These medications look expensive," he sneered, holding up a box of moxifloxacin with theatrical suspicion. Monica's voice remained steady but firm as she explained. "They're donations from the Johnson Foundation, in partnership with pharmaceutical companies. This work saves lives." Stevens scoffed. "Executive director flying first class to deliver medicines, seems wasteful. Why not coach like everyone else?" The implication was clear and cutting. Her presence in first class was illegitimate, undeserved. Monica met his disdain with unwavering dignity. "My travel arrangements are irrelevant to security screening. Please focus on legitimate concerns." Undeterred, Stevens leaned in, his face inches from hers. Voice low but venomous. "You know what I've learned in 15 years? People like you don't belong in first class." The words landed like a blow, exposing the raw prejudice fueling his actions. Monica's composure flickered, but she summoned her strength and demanded to speak to his supervisor. Stevens shrugged off the request with contempt, dismissing it as a waste of time. The room felt charged with hostility as Stevens escalated his tactics, mixing deliberate mishandling of the medical supplies, scattering pills, knocking over containers, with thinly veiled threats. "Maybe next time you'll show some respect for the process," he taunted, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. Nearby travelers watched in stunned silence, some hid their discomfort behind phone screens, recording the unfolding injustice. Others looked away, unwilling or afraid to intervene. Then came the moment that shattered all pretense of professionalism. Stevens, his voice rising so all could hear, accused Monica of potential threat and aggressive behavior, despite her calm demeanor. Without cause, he reached for his handcuffs. The cold metal clicking open in a deliberate show of power. "Turn around, hands behind your back." The humiliation was public and unmistakable, a display of dominance designed to break her spirit. Monica's refusal to comply silently and her poised assertion of rights only intensified Stevens's fury. As the cold cuffs snapped shut around her wrists, tightened one notch beyond necessity to inflict discomfort without evidence, the terminal fell into a heavy silence broken only by murmurs of disbelief and the quiet whir of cameras capturing every moment. This was no longer about security, it was a calculated abuse of power rooted in deep-seated prejudice. A stark reminder of the barriers Monica and countless others faced daily, even in places meant to ensure safety and fairness. The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into Monica Johnson's wrists as Officer Mark Stevens tightened them with a deliberate cruelty that spoke volumes beyond the physical discomfort. This was a public spectacle, a calculated assertion of dominance meant to humiliate and silence. His voice echoed through the crowded terminal, loud enough for every passerby to hear. "People like you don't belong in first class." The jeer hung in the air, sharp and biting, casting a shadow over Monica's dignified composure. Around them, a loose crowd had gathered, travelers clutching boarding passes, phone cameras raised discreetly but determinedly, capturing every second of the unfolding injustice. Monica's mind was steady despite the sting on her skin and the weight of eyes upon her. The mission that had brought her here, the lives depending on those scattered medical supplies, remained her unwavering focus. "Before you place me under arrest on fabricated charges," she said calmly, her voice resolute amidst the growing tension, "I would like to make one phone call." Stevens scoffed, dismissing her rights with a cruel smirk. "This isn't a TV show. You don't get a phone call until you're at the station." But Monica's confidence did not waver. "I have not been formally arrested yet. As a citizen, I retain my rights." Her tone brooked no argument, the certainty in her voice cutting through the haze of intimidation like a beacon. With practiced fingers, She dialed the number etched into her memory, her calm voice carrying clearly to those nearby as she spoke to her husband. David Johnson, CEO of Skyline Airlines. David, it's me. I need you at Terminal B Security Checkpoint 7. Officer Stevens is attempting to arrest me on fabricated charges. I'm fine. I've remained completely calm. Yes, there are witnesses and recordings. I understand. I'll see you soon. Stevens rolled his eyes, visibly unimpressed by what he perceived as a bluff. A husband rushing to rescue his wife. Maybe he can visit you in the holding cell. He sneered. But what Stevens didn't know was the weight behind that name. The man on the other end of the line was no ordinary husband. David Johnson was a titan in the aviation industry. A man who had risen from the very ranks Stevens patrolled, now commanding influence that stretched from baggage handlers to board members. His meeting with the governor had just ended, but now he was racing through the terminal. The gravity of the situation igniting a controlled fury beneath his calm exterior. Stevens' world began to crumble as the realization dawned. He had chosen the wrong woman to intimidate. The wrong day to let his prejudice dictate his actions. Monica's arrest would not be a quiet footnote but a public reckoning that would ripple through the very fabric of the airport and beyond. You are under arrest for disorderly conduct and obstruction of security procedures, Stevens declared, his voice dripping with false authority. Turn around and place your hands behind your back. The gasps from onlookers were audible. A collective intake of breath at the escalation from harassment to blatant abuse of power. Monica, ever composed, slowly turned, the cold steel closing tighter as Stevens tightened the cuffs once more. Each notch a small act of petty cruelty designed to assert control without leaving evidence. Her dignity remained unbroken even as Stevens carelessly gathered her scattered belongings, medical supplies tossed haphazardly into her bag. Fragile hopes crushed beneath the weight of his spite. Should have thought about those refugee kids before you decided to be difficult. He taunted, his voice carrying through the terminal. The crowd around them shifted uneasily, some averted their eyes, unwilling to intervene, while others continued recording, determined that the truth would not be buried in silence. Jamie Carter, a young customer service representative for Skyline Airlines, stepped forward, her voice trembling but resolute as she challenged Stevens. Miss Johnson has remained calm and cooperative. This appears to be a violation of both airport protocols and passenger rights. Stevens responded with threats, but Monica's quiet strength and the growing chorus of witnesses had already begun to turn the tide, setting the stage for a confrontation that would expose the deep fractures of power and prejudice hidden beneath the surface of airport security. As the tense scene unfolded beneath the glaring terminal lights, a wave of subtle but unmistakable shifts rippled through the airport's atmosphere. Employees paused in their routines. Conversations hushed as urgent whispers crackled through radios and phones, spreading word of the escalating confrontation. Karen Mitchell, the terminal operations supervisor, who had earlier brushed off Monica's pleas with casual dismissal, now appeared pale and visibly unsettled, her confident facade crumbling under the weight of unfolding reality. Her fingers trembled slightly as she answered a call from higher authorities, her eyes wide with dawning alarm. Across the terminal, other managers and security personnel hastened from their offices, exchanging grave looks and communicating in clipped, coded bursts over their radios. Even Officer Stevens, locked in his standoff with Monica, felt the shifting currents of authority brush against his arrogance, though his ego resisted the signs of impending reckoning. Lieutenant Robert Harris, Stevens's direct supervisor, emerged swiftly from the security office, his expression a mask of professional concern but eyes sharp with urgent intent. Stevens, stand down immediately, he commanded, his voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel. Confusion flickered across Stevens's face. He had rarely been interrupted mid-action, especially not by someone of his lieutenant's stature. I'm handling a disruptive passenger, Stevens argued, trying to maintain control. I've initiated an arrest, but Harris' tone was unyielding, laced with a gravitas that brooked no defiance. Remove those handcuffs now. This is a direct order. The realization hit Stevens like a cold wave, the commanding presence of Lieutenant Harris, backed by rapid communication from the airport's top brass, left no room for hesitation. Slowly, almost reluctantly, Stevens produced the key and unclasped the cold restraints from Monica's wrists, who immediately rubbed the tender marks, her composure intact despite the ordeal. The terminal's buzz grew as the airport director himself, Robert Clark, strode purposefully through the crowd, his tailored suit a stark contrast to the chaos that had erupted under his watch. Sweat glistened on his brow despite the carefully controlled climate, reflecting the gravity of the crisis. Monica's husband, David Johnson, had arrived moments earlier, his piercing gaze sweeping over the scene with the quiet intensity of a man used to commanding respect without raising his voice. Karen Mitchell approached Stevens, her earlier dismissiveness replaced by a forced apology. "Officer Stevens, this situation is being taken very seriously." But David's voice cut through with icy steel as he interrupted. "I didn't know who Mrs. Johnson was? Would your response have been the same if you had?" The question hung heavy in the air, unanswerable and damning. Stevens shrank beneath the weight of exposure. The carefully constructed armor of arrogance began to crumble. The airport director, sensing the potential fallout, attempted to steer the conversation toward private negotiations. But David's refusal was unequivocal. This was a public humiliation. Any resolution must be public as well. Around them, the crowd that had gathered bore witness not only to a personal injustice but to a systemic failure laid bare. Jamie Carter, the young airline employee who had bravely spoken up, was recognized by David, her nervousness replaced by a tentative pride. The seeds of change had been planted amidst the turmoil. As authority, influence, and courage converged to challenge the entrenched prejudice that had threatened to silence Monica Johnson's voice, and in doing so, sparked a reckoning that would reverberate far beyond the walls of the terminal. David Johnson moved through the crowd with a purposeful stride, the weight of his presence commanding attention without a word spoken. At 45, he embodied the quiet strength of a man who had risen not by privilege but through relentless determination and vision. From a night shift baggage handler to the formidable CEO of Skyline Airlines, a company now boasting over 300 aircraft and employing thousands. His eyes, sharp and unwavering, scanned the scene before settling on his wife, Monica, still marked by the cold impression of the cuffs that had unjustly restrained her wrists. The controlled fury beneath his calm exterior was unmistakable. This was a man who knew the power of influence and was prepared to wield it decisively. Officer Mark Stevens, once brimming with arrogant certainty, now stood frozen, the color draining from his face as the full gravity of his miscalculation dawned upon him. The realization that he had targeted the wrong woman, that his prejudice had exposed him to a reckoning far beyond his control, shattered his facade. Beside David, the company's chief legal counsel stepped forward, tablet in hand, already accessing the security footage that captured every humiliating second of Stevens's conduct, the selective scrutiny, the baseless accusations, the public shaming. "Mr. Johnson," the counsel began, voice steady but grave, "the footage clearly shows discriminatory treatment. We're prepared to pursue a full investigation." David nodded sharply, his gaze cutting toward Stevens. "This isn't an isolated incident. It's systemic. We will hold everyone accountable." The airport director, Robert Clark, approached hastily, his expression strained as he sought to contain the escalating crisis. "Mr. Johnson, we take these allegations seriously. Perhaps we can discuss this matter privately." David's reply was resolute and unwavering. "There is nothing private about public humiliation. Any resolution must be as public as the offense." The crowd of onlookers, staff, and passengers bore witness to a moment that transcended a single arrest. It was a confrontation between entrenched injustice and unyielding accountability. Lieutenant Robert Harris, Stevens's superior, stood nearby, his face a mix of professional concern and frustration. "Officer Stevens is suspended pending investigation," he declared, the words sealing Stevens's fate. Yet David pressed further, demanding systemic reforms, mandatory body cameras, independent anti-bias training, transparent complaint processes, and consequences for supervisors who enable misconduct. His voice carried the weight of authority and vision, not only for Skyline Airlines but for every traveler who would pass through the terminal thereafter. Jamie Carter, the young employee who had courageously spoken up, watched with wide eyes as her actions were acknowledged by the CEO himself. a symbol that integrity and bravery could indeed shift the course of entrenched systems. For Stevens, the moment was devastating, the collapse of a 15-year career built on unchecked authority and silent complicity. As he stood diminished before the crowd, the full scope of his error, the personal, professional, and public consequences, settled upon him like a heavy fog. David Johnson's intervention was not merely a defense of his wife, it was a clarion call for justice, respect, and systemic change, setting into motion a ripple effect that would transform airport security protocols and challenge the very foundations of prejudice within the institution. 6 months later, the once tense atmosphere of the international terminal had transformed into a space of renewed trust and respect. The echoes of that fateful day lingered not as scars but as catalysts for profound change. Across every checkpoint, uniformed security personnel now bore body cameras, sleek devices that captured every interaction with unwavering transparency, ensuring accountability where before there was none. The signage throughout the terminal spoke in multiple languages, clearly outlining traveler rights and the procedures for filing complaints. A visible commitment to fairness that welcomed and empowered every passenger. The staff roster reflected the rich diversity of the traveling public, a mosaic of faces and backgrounds working in concert to safeguard not just security, but dignity. Officer Mark Stevens, once the embodiment of unchecked authority and prejudice, was no longer stationed at the screening lanes. After a rigorous 3-month suspension filled with introspective retraining and over 200 hours of community service with the Johnson Foundation's domestic programs, he had voluntarily transferred to the department's newly established Community Relations Division. There, stripped of his former arrogance, he dedicated himself to rebuilding bridges between security personnel and minority communities. Sharing lessons learned the hard way, Monica Johnson continued her humanitarian missions. Her focus broadened by her own ordeal to include advocacy against discrimination in public spaces. The foundation she led became a beacon for education, producing materials and training programs now integrated into security personnel curricula nationwide. At the security checkpoint, a familiar figure in a community relations uniform engaged with a group of fresh recruits. His voice steady but humble. It was Stevens, now a living testament to the possibility of redemption and growth. Monica, passing by on her way to another mission, caught his eye, a brief, mutual nod acknowledging a journey that had altered both their paths irrevocably. Nearby, Jamie Carter, now proudly wearing a supervisor's badge, greeted Monica with a warm smile and confirmed that her usual seat was ready. A symbol of the respect that had become standard rather than exceptional. The airline's new slogan, emblazoned boldly across the terminal facade, declared a simple yet powerful truth: everyone deserves first-class respect. It was a promise forged in the crucible of injustice, upheld by courage, and carried forward by a community committed to change. The ripple effects of that day continued to spread beyond the terminal walls, inspiring airports across the nation to adopt similar reforms, ensuring that the painful lesson learned would safeguard countless travelers from prejudice and abuse. In the skies above and the terminals below, a new chapter had begun, one where dignity was as integral to the journey as safety, and where the courage of one woman and the influence of her husband had sparked a revolution in respect. As Monica settled into her familiar first-class seat on the plane, the hum of the engines blending with the soft rustle of cabin life, she allowed herself a moment of reflection, a quiet reckoning with the journey that had brought her here. Far beyond the confines of that terminal confrontation, the months since that day had been a whirlwind of change, not just for her, but for an entire system once mired in silent prejudice. Her humanitarian work, which had always centered on healing the world's most vulnerable, now carried an added mission: to confront and dismantle the very biases that sought to limit who deserved dignity and respect. Whether in a refugee camp or a bustling airport, the Foundation's new programs, born from her own experience, had become powerful tools in educating security personnel nationwide, weaving awareness and empathy into the fabric of public service. Across the cabin, familiar faces greeted her with genuine warmth. Jamie Carter, now a confident supervisor pursuing her business degree, exchanged encouraging smiles, a living symbol of the change Monica's courage had helped ignite. David's voice, ever steady and supportive, echoed in her mind, a reminder that progress often required both relentless determination and the unwavering support of allies. Looking out the window, Monica saw the sprawling terminal below. Emblazoned with Skyline Airlines' new slogan, "Everyone deserves first-class respect." It was more than words, it was a promise hard-earned through struggle, resilience, and strategic advocacy. The man who had once sought to silence her now stood transformed. A testament to the possibility of growth and redemption within systems too often resistant to change. As the plane ascended, piercing the clouds and carving a path toward distant horizons, Monica felt a profound sense of purpose rekindled. The battle for respect and justice was far from over. But the ripples of that single day's courage had become waves, reshaping the tides of power and prejudice. With each mission she embarked upon, whether delivering life-saving medicine or championing human dignity, Monica carried the conviction that change was possible. That one voice could echo through the halls of power and inspire a world where every traveler, every individual, truly belonged.